In the middle of a busy sidewalk, a little girl sitting on the ground begs a passing millionaire. "Sir, buy my painting, I need money." He smiles, curious about the simple stick figure drawing, and asks what she wanted to portray. But the girl's innocent answer is an unexpected blow that makes the millionaire break down in tears right there. What she reveals about the drawing and her reason for needing to sell it leads the rich man to make a decision that will change his life forever. The biting cold sliced through the morning air, and Richard Anderson pulled his Italian wool coat tighter as he walked briskly down Park Avenue. His Italian leather shoes echoed on the icy concrete, marking the rhythm of a life that knew no pause. The Swiss watch on his wrist showed 7:45 a.m. He still had 15 minutes before the meeting that would define the future of his investment firm. At 42, Richard had built a financial empire that placed him among the wealthiest men in the country. His routine was mathematical: wake up at 5 a.m., exercise for an hour, review reports during breakfast, and arrive at the office before any employee. There was no room for unforeseen events in his meticulously planned schedule. The wind gusted stronger, making dry leaves dance across the sidewalk. Richard quickened his pace, his eyes fixed on the mirrored skyscraper that housed his office, on the 40th floor. It was then that something unusual caught his attention: a small figure sitting on the ground, near the entrance of a still-closed store. A girl of about 8 years old was there, wearing a threadbare coat that seemed too big for her small frame. Her brown hair fell over her shoulders in messy strands, and in her small hands she held what looked like a makeshift drawing. Richard slowed his pace, intrigued by the child's presence at that time and place. "Mr. Buy my drawing? I need money." The girl's sweet, clear voice cut through the morning air like a distant bell. Richard stopped completely, his eyes meeting hers. Large, dark, and carrying a sadness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. For a moment, the world around him seemed to fall silent. The cars, the honking, the frantic movement of the city. Everything disappeared. He was used to ignoring pleas for handouts. Every day, dozens of people approached him on the streets, holding out a hand or telling stories of need. Richard had developed an emotional shield against these situations, moving on without even slowing down. But there was something different about this girl. Maybe it was the sincere tone of her voice, without the rehearsed drama he usually heard. Or maybe it was the fact that she wasn't just asking, but offering something in return. The drawing in her hands was small, made on a piece of poster board that had seen better days, but there was a tenderness in it that Richard couldn't ignore. "What did you draw there?" he asked, surprising himself with his own question. A half smile formed on his face, a mixture of genuine curiosity and skepticism. The girl held up the drawing carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. It was a simple drawing made with colored pencils that had lost much of their intensity. Colorful stick figures formed 4 shapes: a man, a woman, a child, and a shorter, older woman. They all had smiles drawn in imperfect circles, and their hands touched in a chain of affection. "This was my family," the girl said, her voice carrying a weight that made Richard's chest tighten. "Before there was Daddy, Mommy, me, and Grandma. But now I only have Grandma, and she's very sick. I need money to buy her medicine." The child's words fell on Richard like stones in a calm lake, creating ripples that spread to every corner of his soul. He felt a lump form in his throat, a long-forgotten sensation that caught him completely off guard. In that simple stick-figure drawing, in those words spoken with such innocence and pain, Richard recognized something he had tried to bury in the depths of his memory. His own story, his own childhood. Richard remained motionless for a few seconds. That felt like an eternity, the girl's drawing still before his eyes. The stick figures danced in his vision, awakening memories he had locked away with 7 keys somewhere dark in his mind. Grandma Carmen, the smell of medicine, the sleepless nights, listening to the difficult breathing of the only person left in his life. "How much do you want for the drawing?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. The girl's eyes lit up with a timid hope. $10, mister. It's just for Grandma's medicine, I promise. $10. Richard spent more than that on a cup of coffee at his favorite cafe. He took his wallet from the inner pocket of his coat, an automatic movement he made dozens of times a day. But when his fingers touched the bills, something made him hesitate. It wasn't the amount, it was the meaning behind it. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to be at her level. "Isabella, and Grandma's name is Mrs. Eleanor." The girl smiled, a smile that lit up her face, despite the sadness she carried. "She taught me to draw. She says when you draw with love, people can feel it." Richard swallowed hard. Mrs. Eleanor had taught him the same thing so many years ago. When he drew with charcoal on the walls of the shack where they lived, she never scolded him. On the contrary, she always said that drawing was a way of speaking with the heart. "Is your grandma in the hospital?" he asked, handing Isabella a $50 bill. The girl's eyes widened, looking at the bill as if it were a treasure. "No, mister, she's at home, but she coughs a lot and can't get up. The man at the pharmacy said the medicine costs $40, and I'd only managed to sell 2 drawings this week." Richard felt a pang in his chest. He remembered when he was 9, running around the city, trying to sell homemade cookies that Grandma Carmen made to get money for her medications. People passed by him as if he were invisible, just like he himself did every day now. "Keep the change," he said, standing up, and he hesitated for a moment. "Take care of yourselves, okay?" Isabella nodded, clutching the money to her chest. "Thank you, mister. Grandma will be so happy. She always says good people still exist in the world." Richard walked towards his building, but with each step, he felt as if he were moving away from something important. He entered the elevator, pressed the button for the 40th floor, and watched the numbers climb. 40 floors away from that girl's reality, 40 floors away from who he had once been. The meeting began promptly at 8 o'clock. Richard greeted the Japanese investors, presented the profitability charts, and discussed expansion strategies for the Asian market. His mind, usually sharp as a razor during negotiations, constantly drifted to the image of the stick figure drawing. "Mr. Anderson." His partner Michael's voice brought him back to reality. "The gentlemen are asking about our social responsibility policy." Richard blinked, reorganizing his thoughts. Social responsibility. He had created a foundation years ago, more for tax reasons than genuine social concern. Occasional donations, charity events attended by the New York elite, all very well documented for the press. "Of course," he replied, going on autopilot. "Our foundation has been investing in educational projects." But as he spoke, his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about an 8-year-old girl sitting on the cold ground, selling drawings to buy medicine. He was thinking about how he had become exactly the type of person who used to ignore him as a child. The meeting ended successfully. New contracts, new millions in his account. But for the first time in years, Richard wondered if he had truly succeeded in life. The next 3 days were a silent torture for Richard. He tried to maintain his usual routine, meetings, reports, decisions that moved millions, but the image of Isabella and her stick figure drawing wouldn't leave his mind. During meals at 5-star restaurants, he thought of the girl. Amidst corporate presentations, he saw her hopeful smile, even in his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by works of art that cost more than many people would earn in a lifetime. He felt haunted by the touching simplicity of that drawing. On Wednesday morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. It was 5 o'clock when he found himself sitting on the balcony of his apartment, watching the still sleeping city. The coffee steamed in the cup in his hands, but he didn't even remember making it. His mind was completely absorbed by an unease he couldn't name. He decided to go for a walk, something he hadn't done in years. Usually, a driver took him directly from his building's garage to the office, but that morning he felt the need to feel the asphalt under his feet. He put on a simple tracksuit, something completely out of character, and went down to the lobby. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," greeted Robert, the doorman who worked the night shift. "Out early today?" "Just going for a walk," Richard replied, surprised to realize he had never paid attention to the name of the man he'd seen every day for 5 years. Robert smiled. "That's good, sir. Sometimes we need to breathe a little, right? My granddaughter always says walking is good for the heart." Granddaughter. Richard nodded politely and left, but the word echoed in his mind throughout his walk. How many people around him had grandchildren, children, families waiting for them at home? How many stories had he never bothered to learn? Without consciously realizing it, his steps led him back to Park Avenue, to the exact spot where he had met Isabella. The spot was empty at that hour, just a few dry leaves dancing in the wind. Richard stood there for a few minutes, trying to understand why he had gone there. "She usually shows up around 7:30, a voice said behind him. Richard turned and saw a middle-aged man in a city sanitation uniform leaning on a broom. His eyes were kind, but they held the mark of someone who had seen a lot of suffering in life. "How did you know Richard began. "I saw you talking to Isabella a few days ago. It's not common to see someone like you stopping to talk to her." The man didn't say it judgmentally, just as a statement of fact. "I'm John. Been cleaning this area for 15 years. Richard introduced himself, feeling strangely uncomfortable with his own formality. "The girl, does she come here every day?" "Almost every day," John confirmed, resuming his sweeping. "Poor thing. Her grandma really is very sick. I often see Isabella rushing to the pharmacy with the few coins she earns. Hard-working girl, never seen her actually begging, always has some drawing to offer." "And where do they live?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. John stopped sweeping and looked at him intently. There was something in his eyes Richard couldn't decipher, perhaps suspicion, perhaps hope. "Over in Hope Creek, on the south side. A humble little place, but Mrs. Eleanor always kept everything very clean and organized. A strong woman, that one. Worked in rich folks' houses, you know. But age and illness." John shook his head sadly. Hope Creek. Richard knew the name. It was one of the most deprived communities in the metropolitan area. A place he had never set foot in, but which now exerted an inexplicable magnetic pull on him. "Thanks for the information," Richard said, taking a $100 bill from his pocket. "For your coffee." John looked at the bill and then at Richard. "No need, mister. But if you really want to help, Isabella will be here soon. She's the one who needs it." Richard put the money away, suddenly feeling small before the simple dignity of that man. He looked once more at the spot where Isabella used to sit and made a decision that would change everything. Richard cancelled all his meetings for that morning, something unthinkable in his rigid routine. Sitting in his office, he looked out the panoramic window at the city stretching to the horizon, but his thoughts were focused on a small shack in Hope Creek. The decision was made. He needed to see Isabella and her grandmother's reality. He called his driver, Charles, who had worked for him for 8 years. It had always been a strictly professional relationship. Good morning, good afternoon, precise addresses and silence during the drives. But that morning, when Charles arrived with the black Mercedes, Richard surprised himself by asking a question he had never asked before. "Charles, do you have a family?" The driver adjusted the rearview mirror, clearly surprised by the question. "I do, Mr. Anderson. A wife and 2 young children. And are they well? Do they have everything they need? Charles smiled into the rearview mirror. Thank God, yes. My job here allows me to provide a decent life for them. My boys go to a good school, and my wife managed to open a small bakery in our neighborhood. Richard nodded, feeling a twinge of something he couldn't identify. Envy, nostalgia. Today we're going to a different place. Hope Creek. Do you know it? I do, sir. It's a rough area, but there are good people there. May I ask the reason for the visit? Personal matter, Richard replied, ending the conversation. The drive to Hope Creek took over an hour in the city's heavy traffic. As they moved away from the financial district, the scenery changed drastically. The mirrored skyscrapers gave way to simple buildings. Paved streets turned into narrow, potholed roads. Richard watched everything through the window, feeling like a foreigner in his own city. When they reached the entrance to the community, Charles parked the car and turned to Richard. Sir, with all due respect, but the car draws a lot of attention. Here, maybe it's better if I accompany you. Richard accepted the suggestion, realizing that his own attire, Italian suit and leather shoes, also marked him as an intruder in that environment. They walked through narrow alleys, passing simple houses where children played in doorways and women chatted while hanging clothes on lines. They asked a few people for Mrs. Eleanor, and everyone knew the old lady and her granddaughter. A middle-aged woman in a floral apron and a welcoming smile offered to show them the way. Eleanor's a dear soul here, she explained as they walked. Always helped everyone when she could. Now that she's sick, the community tries to give back, but everyone has their own struggles, you know? They arrived at a small wooden and masonry shack, painted a faded blue. There was a small garden in front, well tended despite the simplicity, with a few flowers that defied the poverty of the soil. It was exactly as John had described, humble but clean and organized. Richard hesitated. At the door, feeling his heart race. What would he say when he met her? How would he explain his presence there? Before he could organize his thoughts, he heard a weak voice coming from inside the house. Isabella, honey, are you back? The voice was that of an elderly woman, clearly debilitated by illness. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something familiar in that voice, something that awakened fragmented memories of his childhood. Charles knocked gently on the wooden dukkha. Mrs. Eleanor, you have a visitor. Slow footsteps approached the door, which opened to reveal a woman of about 70. Despite the apparent frailty caused by her illness, her eyes were lively and intelligent. She looked first at Charles, then at Richard, and her expression changed completely. Good heavens, she murmured, leaning against the doorframe. Richie Anderson. The world stopped around Richard. That voice, that time-worn face, those eyes that had watched him grow. How had he not recognized her before? Mrs. Eleanor wasn't just Isabella's grandmother. She had been a cook in his family's house when he was a child, in the last years before he lost his parents. Mrs. Eleanor, he managed to whisper, his legs feeling weak. You remember me? Mrs. Eleanor brought a trembling hand to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. My boy, how you've grown. You were 8 the last time I saw you. Now you're a grown man. She coughed, a dry cough that echoed through the small house. Come in. I can't believe it's really you. Richard entered the shack with hesitant steps, Charles remaining respectfully outside. The interior was small but organized, with simple furniture that told a story of decades of care and love. On the wall, there was a small gallery of Isabella's drawings. Flowers, houses, smiling families made with colored pencils. Sit here in the good chair, Mrs. Eleanor said, indicating a mended but clean armchair. I'll make some coffee, or do you prefer juice? I have oranges from the neighbors. Tree. Don't bother, Mrs. Eleanor, please sit down. You're sick. Richard gently held the old woman's arm, helping her settle into the chair. She smiled, and in that smile Richard saw the same woman who used to make special cookies for him when he came home from school crying because the other boys made fun of his mended clothes. "You were always polite, Richie, even as a little boy, always with good manners." "Mrs. Eleanor." Richard sat on the edge of the simple bed, trying to organize his words. "I met your granddaughter, Isabella. She was selling drawings on the street." The old woman's face contorted with worry. "I didn't want her to, son. I told her not to go out with this cough, but she insists on helping. Says she needs to buy my medicine." She sighed deeply. Stubborn girl. Her heart's too big for her size. "Where are her parents?" Richard asked, though he already feared the answer. "My son Peter and his wife died in a car accident 2 years ago. Isabella has been with me ever since." Mrs. Eleanor wiped away a tear that ran down her wrinkled face. "I tried to give her the best, but with this illness—" She coughed again, a cough that seemed to tear at her lungs. Richard got up and poured her a glass of water. As Mrs. Eleanor drank, he looked around and noticed details that disturbed him. The old, rumbling refrigerator, the small, worn-out pots, the medicines lined up on an improvised shelf. Everything spoke of a daily struggle for survival. "Mrs. Eleanor, I need to ask you something," he said, sitting down again. "Why did you leave my parents' house? I remember one day you just weren't there anymore." The old woman's expression changed, becoming distant and melancholic. "Ah, son, that was so long ago." She hesitated, as if deciding how much of the truth she should reveal. "Something happened, a misunderstanding. Your mother was very nervous back then, with your father's illness getting worse." "What misunderstanding?" Richard insisted, feeling he was about to discover something important. Mrs. Eleanor sighed heavily. "Some money went missing from your father's desk drawer. It wasn't much, but in that situation, your mother thought it was me. I tried to explain I'd never do such a thing, that I'd always worked honestly, but—" She shook her head sadly. "It was no use. I was fired the same day, couldn't even say goodbye to you." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. He vaguely remembered that period, his mother screaming, his father growing weaker in bed, the tense atmosphere in the house, and Mrs. Eleanor, who always comforted him with her stories and cookies, simply disappeared from his life. "But I know who took that money," she continued, lowering her voice. "I saw your cousin Claudia leaving the study that day, looking very nervous, but who would believe a maid over a family member? Claudia." Richard remembered her perfectly. His mother's sister's daughter always had drug problems. She had spent a few months at their house during that turbulent period, and Mrs. Eleanor had been unjustly blamed and fired for something she didn't do. "Mrs. Eleanor, he began, but was interrupted by the door opening. Isabella ran in, breathless and with cheeks red from the cold. She stopped suddenly when she saw Richard, her eyes widening in surprise and joy. Mr. came to visit us," she exclaimed, running to hug him. Richard received her in his arms, feeling his heart tighten. The girl was even smaller than she seemed on the street, and he could feel how thin she was under the threadbare coat. "Grandma, look who came to see us. It's the mister who bought my drawing." Isabella snuggled into Richard's lap with the naturalness of a child who still believed in people's kindness. Her hair smelled of cheap soap, and her eyes shone with a genuine happiness that made his chest ache even more. Grandma was so happy with the money you gave. We were able to buy the medicine and still have some left for bread," she said, showing a smile that revealed a new tooth coming in. "Grandma said good people like you are angels in disguise." Richard looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who watched the scene with teary eyes. The irony of the situation hit him with devastating force. Here he was, being called an angel by a family his own family had wronged decades ago. The woman who had been unjustly fired now saw him as a blessing, unaware that he bore part of the responsibility for her suffering. "Isabella, go wash your hands for lunch," Mrs. Eleanor said, sensing Richard needed a moment to process the information. The girl obeyed promptly, humming softly as she headed to the small bathroom. As soon as they were alone, Mrs. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair. "Richie, you're not to blame for what happened," she said, as if she could read his thoughts. "You were just a child, and your mother was desperate with your father dying and the bills piling up. But I could have done something when I grew up," Richard murmured, his voice heavy with remorse. "I could have looked for you. I could have found out the truth. And what would that change? The past is past, son. What matters is the present." She coughed again, placing a hand on her chest. "And now you're here. Maybe it's fate putting things right." Richard stood up and began to pace the small room, trying to sort through the whirlwind of emotions engulfing him. Guilt, anger, sadness, responsibility. It all mixed into an emotional storm he didn't know how to face. "Mrs. Eleanor, I want to help. I want to pay for private treatment for you, a better house, school for Isabella." The words tumbled out, full of urgency. The old woman's expression subtly hardened. "Son, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, but I can't accept charity. I've always worked for things, always had my dignity." "It's not charity," Richard protested. "It's justice. It's the least I can do after what?" She interrupted him, her voice firm. "You don't owe me anything, Richie. Nothing. If you want to help, find a way that doesn't hurt my pride." Isabella returned from washing her hands and noticed the tension in the air. With the peculiar sensitivity of children, she approached her grandmother and held her hand. "Grandma, is the Mr. angry?" she asked, looking worriedly at Richard. "No, sweetie. The Mr. is a good person. He's just thinking about how he can help us." Richard knelt in front of Isabella, taking her small hands in his. "Isabella, would you like to not have to sell drawings on the street anymore?" The girl's eyes lit up. "I would, mister, but who will buy Grandma's medicine and the food? What if I found a job for your grandma? A job she could do right here without having to leave the house?" Mrs. Eleanor frowned. "What kind of job?" Richard thought quickly. He needed to find a solution that preserved the family's dignity but also ensured their financial security. Suddenly, an idea began to form in his mind. "You always made the best food I've ever tasted, and I remember your special cookies." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I have a company with over 200 employees. What if you provided homemade food for the meetings? Cakes, savory snacks, sweets?" Mrs. Eleanor looked at him skeptically. "Son, I cook in a simple kitchen with old pots. I can provide equipment, but you would still be the chef, responsible for everything. It would be a real business, with a contract and everything." For the first time since he had arrived, Richard saw a glimmer of hope in the old woman's eyes. Isabella jumped. With joy, "Grandma, you could make those brownies I love, and the cheese puffs." "Easy, easy," Mrs. Eleanor said, but Richard could see the idea had captivated her. "That would be a lot of work, and I don't know if I have the strength." "I can help," Isabella exclaimed. "I can be Grandma's assistant." Richard smiled, feeling he had finally found a way. It wouldn't be charity, it would be a real opportunity for work and dignity. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Something much bigger was happening here, something that would change not only their lives, but his own. 3 weeks had passed since Richard had set up the homemade food business with Mrs. Eleanor. What started as a small order for his executive meetings quickly grew into something much larger. The reputation of her sweets and savories spread through the company's hallways, and orders began pouring in from other floors. Richard visited Hope Creek almost every day, always with Charles for company. The driver had become more than an employee. He was almost a friend, someone Richard could talk to about the changes he felt happening in his life. The visits always included some time with Isabella, who had become the ray of sunshine in his increasingly somber days at the office. That Tuesday, when they arrived at the faded blue house, they found the door ajar and a worrying silence in the air. Richard knocked lightly on the wood before entering, calling their names. "Mrs. Eleanor? Isabella?" A faint moan came from inside the house. Richard entered quickly and found Mrs. Eleanor collapsed on the kitchen floor, conscious but clearly very weak. Scattered pots around her indicated she had fainted while preparing an order. "My God, Charles, call an ambulance!" Richard shouted, kneeling beside her. No need," Mrs. Eleanor murmured, trying to get up. "Just a dizzy spell. It's past." But Richard could see it wasn't just a dizzy spell. She was pale, sweating coldly, and her breathing was irregular. "Where's Isabella?" "At school. She can't see me like this." The old woman's voice was broken. Promise me you won't tell her. Mrs. Eleanor, you need to go to the hospital now." She gripped Richard's arm with surprising strength. "Son, listen to me. If anything happens to me," she coughed, a little blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. "Isabella can't go into the system. She can't." Richard's heart pounded. "Nothing's going to happen. We'll take care of you. Promise me. Promise you'll take care of her." "I promise," Richard said, without even thinking about the implications of that promise. Charles came running back. "The ambulance is on its way. Mr. Anderson, I found this on the table." He handed over an opened letter, clearly from the public. "Hospital." Richard read it quickly and felt his blood run cold. The diagnosis was much worse than he imagined. Mrs. Eleanor had severe pneumonia that had progressed to a systemic infection. The recommended treatment was immediate hospitalization and expensive medications that weren't available through public health care. When the ambulance arrived, Richard insisted on accompanying Mrs. Eleanor. During the ride to the hospital, she held his hand with fragile strength, whispering worries about Isabella that broke his heart. At the hospital, reality proved even harsher. The line for admission was long, beds were scarce, and care was slow. Richard found himself facing an inhuman bureaucracy that treated Mrs. Eleanor as just another number, another social case of no importance. "Doctor, she needs to be admitted immediately," Richard told the attending physician, a young man who looked as overwhelmed as he was tired. "Sir, we have dozens of cases like this. She's in line, but it could take a few days to get her a bed." "A few days? She could die." The doctor sighed, looking at Richard with a mixture of compassion and frustration. "Do you think we don't know that? We work with what we have. If you want faster care, try a private hospital." But when Richard suggested transferring Mrs. Eleanor to a private hospital, he faced another obstacle. She had no health insurance, proper documentation, and the hospital required family authorization, which she couldn't provide in her current state. That's when Richard made the decision that would change everything. He signed as financially responsible for all her treatment, committing to costs that could run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. But more than that, on the official paperwork, when asked about his relationship with the patient, he wrote de facto grandson. At that moment, in a hospital waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and despair, Richard understood he wasn't just paying off a past debt. He was choosing a family. He was choosing to love. And when Isabella came running down the hospital corridors, brought by a neighbor who had seen the ambulance, Richard welcomed her into his arms, knowing his life had changed forever. "Uncle Richie, is Grandma going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes full of tears. "We'll do everything possible," he replied, and for the first time in years, Richard Anderson made a promise, thinking with his heart, not his head. The 5 days Mrs. Eleanor spent in the ICU were the longest of Richard's life. He had turned one of his penthouse rooms into a temporary space for Isabella, who flatly refused to be away from him. The girl had created a ritual. Every morning she drew a new picture for her grandmother, hoping it would help her get better faster. It was a grey Thursday when Richard received the call he dreaded. It wasn't from the hospital. It was from Michael, his partner, with news that caught him completely off guard. "Richard, we need to talk urgently. I'm coming up to your office now." Michael arrived accompanied by two men Richard recognized immediately, the company's lawyers. Their serious expressions made his stomach clench. "Richard," Michael began, sitting at the conference table uninvited, "we've received some disturbing information. Apparently, you've signed as legal guardian for a minor and an elderly woman with no kinship. So what?" Richard tried to keep his voice firm, but he sensed where this conversation was headed. "So this could be interpreted as an attempt at irregular adoption, or worse." Dr. Mendez, the older lawyer, leaned forward. "We received an anonymous tip suggesting your intentions might not be appropriate." Richard felt his blood boil. What kind of tip? A single, wealthy man approaching a child in a vulnerable situation, Dr. Mendez listed coldly. "Taking her to live in his home, assuming parental responsibilities without legal authorization. Are you insinuating that I—" Richard couldn't finish the sentence. Such was his outrage. "We're not insinuating anything," Michael intervened, "but our investors are concerned. A scandal of this magnitude could destroy our reputation and the contracts we just signed." Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Down below, the city continued its frenetic pace, indifferent to the drama unfolding on the 40th floor. "Who made this complaint?" "It was anonymous, but—" Dr. Mendez hesitated. "We suspect it came from someone close to your business circle, someone with access to detailed information about your recent activities." A terrible suspicion began to form in Richard's mind. Only one person had reason to want to harm him this way. "Frederick Castillo," he murmured. Michael confirmed with a nod. Fred Castillo had been Richard's partner years ago, before a turbulent separation that resulted in lawsuits and a rivalry that continued to this day. He always looked for ways to undermine Richard's business, but he had never stooped so low. "Richard, you need to step away from this situation," Michael said. "For the good of the company, for our employees, for the investments." "No." The answer came out firm, without hesitation. Richard turned to face the three men, and they could see a determination in his eyes they had never witnessed before. "I will not abandon Isabella and Mrs. Eleanor. I will not let malicious speculation destroy the only truly important thing that has happened in my life in years." "Richard, be rational," Dr. Mendez insisted. "We can arrange a suitable family. For the girl, a temporary home until what? Until she's forgotten in the system? Until she becomes another statistic?" Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You don't understand. This girl and her grandmother are my family now." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Michael exchanged glances with the lawyers before standing up. "Richard, as your partner and friend, I implore you, reconsider. We have 48 hours before this story leaks to the press. Fred is already mobilizing his contacts." After the three left, Richard was alone in his office, facing the toughest decision of his life. Across town, Isabella waited for him at his home, blindly trusting in his protection. In the hospital, Mrs. Eleanor fought her illness, unaware that the reputation of the man saving her was in jeopardy. Richard picked up the phone and called Charles. "Get the car ready. We're going." A home! When he arrived at the penthouse, he found Isabella in the living room, drawing another picture for her grandmother. She looked up when she saw him, and her innocent smile was like a stab to his heart. "Uncle Richie, I made a new drawing. This time I drew the three of us as a real family." He knelt beside her, looking at the drawing. 3 figures holding hands, smiling under a bright yellow sun. For a moment, Richard allowed himself to imagine that this simple happiness could last forever. But he knew the storm was just beginning. The news broke on Friday morning, exactly as Fred had promised. Richard woke up to dozens of missed calls on his cell phone, and a sensationalist headline splashed across the city's leading financial newspaper: "Millionaire under investigation for alleged irregular adoption of minor." Isabella was still asleep in the next room when Richard read the full article. The text was carefully worded to insinuate without directly accusing, using terms like irregular situation, questions about motivations, and social concerns. His photo appeared next to an archive image of Hope Creek, creating a visual narrative that suggested opportunism. The phone rang. It was Dr. Mendez. "Richard, the situation has worsened. Child Protective Services wants an emergency hearing. They're questioning the legality of Isabella's temporary custody." "But I have all the documents." "Emergency documents signed during a medical crisis. Now they want a full evaluation. And there's more. Fred has filed a complaint with the DA's office, alleging you took advantage of the family's vulnerability." Richard felt the world spin around him. This is a witch hunt. It may be, but it's a witch hunt with public repercussions. The company has already received 3 calls from concerned investors, and Isabella? What about Isabella? She might have to go to a temporary shelter until this whole situation is resolved. At that moment, Richard heard small footsteps approaching the living room. Isabella appeared at the door, wearing the pajamas he had bought for her, pink with teddy bear designs, and rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Uncle Richie, why are you talking so loud?" she asked, approaching with the confidence of someone who truly felt at home. Richard quickly hung up the phone and opened his arms to her. "Good morning, little one. Sleep well?" "I dreamed about Grandma," Isabella said, climbing into his lap. She was better and was making brownies for everyone. "When are we visiting her today?" Richard's heart broke. How could he explain to an 8-year-old child that she might not be able to stay with him anymore? How could he say that malicious? Adults were trying to separate them. "Isabella, I need to explain something important," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Is it about the people saying bad things about you on TV?" she asked innocently. Richard froze. "You saw television?" "When I woke up earlier, I turned it on to watch cartoons. But there was a news story with your picture. The lady said your name and said things I didn't understand." Isabella looked at him with worried eyes. "Did you do something wrong, Uncle Richie?" "No, little one. I didn't do anything wrong. But sometimes, when people don't understand a situation, they make up stories. Like when the boys at school say I don't have a dad or mom." The simplicity of Isabella's comparison struck Richard like a lightning bolt. She had faced prejudice and misunderstanding before. She had dealt with people who judged her situation without knowing her story. "Exactly like that," he confirmed, hugging her tighter. "And what are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight for our family," Richard said, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. "I'm going to prove to everyone that we chose each other, and that's the most important thing in the world." Isabella smiled and kissed him on the cheek. "I'll fight too. I can draw you as a superhero." Later that day, when Richard arrived at the hospital to visit Mrs. Eleanor, he encountered a situation that shook him even more. A social worker was talking to the medical team, and the professional's expressions were grave. "Mr. Anderson, Dr. Sanders, the doctor in charge of the case, called out, 'We need to talk.' In a private corridor, she explained that the hospital had received instructions to restrict Richard's visits until the legal situation was clarified. The social worker had questioned his authority to make medical decisions for Mrs. Eleanor, But she has no one else, Richard protested. We understand the situation, but our hands are tied. These are safety protocols. It was then that a weak voice came from the next room. Doctor, please let my grandson in. Mrs. Eleanor had woken up. For the first time in 5 days, she was conscious and asking to see Richard. The social worker hesitated, but the doctor decided to allow a quick visit. Richard entered the room and saw Mrs. Eleanor connected to several machines, but with alert and determined eyes. She extended a trembling hand to him. Son, I heard the nurse talking. I know they're trying to hurt you because of us. Mrs. Eleanor, don't worry about that. You need to focus on getting better. No, I need to speak. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. If necessary, I'll go on television. I'll tell everyone who you really are. I'll talk about how you saved us, how you gave us back our dignity. Tears rolled down Richard's eyes. You don't have to. Yes, I do, because you're my grandson in heart, and no one will tear our family apart. At that moment, Richard knew he wasn't fighting alone. He had a 70-year-old warrior by his side. The weekend brought a deceptive calm. Richard had decided to keep Isabella away from television and news, creating a bubble of normality in his penthouse. They spent Saturday drawing, cooking, and talking about Mrs. Eleanor, who was showing slow but consistent signs of improvement. It was Monday morning when the world collapsed again. Richard was awakened by insistent knocking on the door. It was 6 a.m., and through the intercom, a formal voice identified itself. Child Protective Services, we need to speak with you. Isabella was still asleep when Richard opened the door to 2 social workers and a court officer. The older one, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, presented the documents. Mr. Anderson, we have an order for an immediate assessment of the situation. Of the minor Isabella Santos, she needs to accompany us to a temporary shelter while the case is investigated. This is absurd. She's safe here. She's loved here. Sir, please don't make things more difficult. These are just standard procedures. The noise of the voices woke Isabella, who appeared in the living room wearing her teddy bear pajamas, clutching the small teddy bear Richard had bought for her. Her large eyes scanned the unfamiliar faces with growing alarm. Uncle Richie, who are these people? The social worker knelt to Isabella's level, forcing a smile. Hi, sweetie. I'm Maria, and I've come to take you to a new place with other children your age. I don't want to go, Isabella said, running to Richard and clinging to his leg. I want to stay with my uncle. Isabella, it'll only be for a few days, Richard lied, trying to keep his voice calm despite the desperation he felt. Until we sort out some annoying adult stuff. No, I don't want to, Isabella started to cry, clinging even tighter to him. You promised we'd be a family. Richard knelt and hugged her, feeling his own tears begin to well up. Isabella, listen to Uncle. It'll be temporary, I promise. And all this confusion will pass. And what if Grandma wakes up and doesn't find me? I'll explain it to her, and I'll visit you every day until you come back. The scene that followed was heartbreaking. Isabella was taken away still in her pajamas, carrying only her teddy bear and crying inconsolably. Richard stood at the door of his apartment, watching the elevator close with the child who had become his reason for living. 2 hours later, when he arrived at the hospital to tell Mrs. Eleanor what had happened, Richard found the room empty. A nurse explained that the patient had had an anxiety attack during the night and needed to be sedated. Apparently, she had dreamed that something bad was happening to Isabella. It was late afternoon when Richard received the call that completely devastated him. It was from the shelter. Mr. Anderson, we have a problem. The girl, Isabella, has disappeared. What? Do you mean disappeared? She took advantage of a moment of distraction during recess and ran away. We've alerted all teams, but we haven't found her yet. Richard hung up the phone and ran to his car. Charles was waiting for him in the parking lot, and for the next 3 hours, they scoured the entire city looking for Isabella. They visited Hope Creek, the spots where she used to sell her drawings, parks, bus stops. Night had fallen when they finally found her. Isabella was sleeping on a bench in Washington Square Park, in the city center, curled up and shivering from the cold. Her teddy bear was clutched tightly to her chest, and she had cried so much that her cheeks were red and swollen. She looked even smaller and more fragile under the yellowish light of the lampposts. "My God, Isabella!" Richard picked her up, feeling how cold she was. "What are you doing here?" She opened her eyes slowly, taking a few seconds to recognize him. When she finally understood he was there, she clung to his neck desperately. "Uncle Richie, I ran away. I don't want to stay in that place. The other children are sad and nobody cares about them." "Isabella, you're freezing. How long have you been here?" "I don't know. I tried to go to Grandma's house, but I got lost. Then I remembered this park where you said you used to play when you were little." Richard wrapped her in his coat, his heart shattering. She had remembered the story he told about his childhood when he slept on the streets after Grandma Carmen's death. In her desperation, Isabella had tried to follow the same path he had. "Little one, you could have gotten hurt. There are dangerous people on the streets at night." "But I had nowhere to go," she sobbed. "That place isn't my home. My home is with you and Grandma." Charles approached, offering a blanket he always kept in the car. "Mr. Anderson, we need to take her to the hospital. She might have hypothermia." On the way to the hospital, Isabella fell asleep in Richard's arms, physically and emotionally exhausted. He watched her sleep, knowing this would probably be one of the last times he could hold her like this. The system would separate them again, and this time security measures would be stricter. It was then that Richard made the most radical decision of his life. He would not allow them to take Isabella again, no matter the personal or professional cost. He would fight for her until the end, even if it meant facing the justice system, society, and everyone who tried to destroy the family they had built. After spending the night at the hospital with Isabella, who, fortunately, had only caught a cold, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone, starting with himself. Instead of hiding from the media and trying to resolve everything in court, he decided to make his version of the story public. On Tuesday morning, he called Francesca Hayes, an investigative journalist for the main local television channel, known for her humanized approach to news. "Francesca, I'd like to give an interview. I want to tell the truth about my relationship with Isabella and Mrs. Eleanor." "Richard, are you sure? This could be risky." "More risky than letting lies spread. I want people to know who they really are." The interview was scheduled for late afternoon and would be broadcast on the evening news. But Richard didn't wait passively. During the day, he mobilized a support network he didn't even know he had. It started with his company's employees. Maria, the receptionist who always greeted him politely, was the first to speak up when she learned of the situation. "Mr. Anderson, I followed everything from the beginning. I saw how you changed after you met Isabella. I saw how you became more human, you know." She paused, emotional. "My daughter is adopted too. I know what true love is between people who choose each other." Next was Robert, the night doorman, who offered to give a statement about how Richard had changed, how he now stopped to chat and always asked about his family. John, the street cleaner who had guided Richard that first day, showed up at the office accompanied by other workers from the area. "Mister, we've seen everything from the start. We saw how you truly care about those two." But it was Charles who brought the most touching surprise. During the afternoon, he arrived at the office accompanied by his wife Marlene and their 2 young children. "Mr. Anderson," said Marlene, a gentle woman with determined eyes, "my husband told me the whole story. I want you to know that our family is on your side." "Marlene, Let me finish. I have a small bakery, but I have contacts with other mothers in the area. We've organized a support chain. If necessary, we'll protest at the courthouse door. Charles's children, a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, shyly approached Richard. "Mister," said the boy, "Daddy said you're sad because they want to take your little girl away from you." "She's not exactly my daughter," Richard tried to explain. "But do you love her?" asked the girl, with the simple wisdom of children. "Very much." "Then she is your daughter," she concluded, handing him a drawing she had made, a happy family with 3 people. In the afternoon, when Richard arrived at the hospital to see Mrs. Eleanor before the interview, he found a scene that deeply moved him. The room was full of people, neighbors from Hope Creek, some employees from his company, and even John. Mrs. Eleanor, sitting up in bed and visibly better, held a petition with hundreds of names. "Son," she said, her voice stronger than Richard had heard in weeks, "all these people want you to continue being Isabella's father. They want our family to stay together." "How did you manage to organize all this?" "Marlene came by this morning," explained a neighbor from Hope Creek. "She told everyone the situation, and the news spread. People who didn't even know you offered to help. Because everyone recognizes true love when they see it," John added, "and that's what you have, true family love." Just then, Isabella came running down the hallway, accompanied by a social worker. The system had decided to allow her to visit her grandmother as long as she was supervised. "Grandma, Uncle Richie!" She threw herself into their arms and for the first time in days smiled genuinely. "My dear granddaughter," Mrs. Eleanor murmured, kissing the girl's face. "How are you?" "Sad, Grandma. I want to go home." "And you will, my love. We'll all fight for it." Richard looked around the room, seeing all those people who had mobilized for a family that wasn't traditional but was real. Workers, neighbors, employees, ordinary people who recognized something extraordinary in the love that united those 3. "Isabella," he said, kneeling to her level, "soon Uncle Richie will be on TV to tell our story, to tell how we met, how we chose each other. Are you going to say we're a family?" "I'm going to say we're the truest family there is. A family born from the heart." Isabella smiled and hugged him tightly. "So everything will be all right, right, Uncle Richie? Because when you truly love, everything always works out." Richard looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly, then at all the people surrounding them with support and affection. For the first time since all the turmoil had begun, he felt hope. When he left for the interview, he was no longer alone. He carried with him the love of a daughter of his heart, the wisdom of a second grandmother, and the strength of an entire community that believed in the transformative power of true love. The television studio had never seemed so intimidating to Richard. Under the intense lights sitting across from Francesca Hayes, he took a deep breath and remembered Isabella's words. "When you truly love, everything always works out." Richard, Francesca, began, her voice professional yet warm. "Much has been said about your relationship with Isabella Santos. I'd like you to tell us, in your own words, how it all began." Richard looked directly at the camera, imagining all the people who would be watching, especially those who truly mattered. "It all started with a stick figure drawing," he said, and his voice came out firmer than he expected. For the next 20 minutes, Richard told the complete story. He spoke about meeting Isabella on Park Avenue, about recognizing his own childhood, in her sad eyes, about discovering that Mrs. Eleanor had worked in his home and been unjustly fired. "Many people are questioning your motivations," Francesca interjected. "How do you respond to accusations that this might be a publicity stunt or worse, something inappropriate?" Richard felt anger rise, but he controlled himself. "Francesca, whoever says that has never seen Isabella drawing at my kitchen table at 7 in the morning, humming as she gets ready for school. They've never seen her cry because she misses her grandmother or smile when she manages to make an especially beautiful drawing." His voice trembled slightly. "Whoever says that has never felt what it's like to have a child call you dad for the first time, even knowing you don't share blood. And what about the legal aspects, the adoption process? I'm doing everything by the book. I have the best lawyers, psychologists, social workers, but the bureaucracy is slow, and meanwhile a child is suffering." Richard leaned forward. "Isabella ran away from a shelter because she isn't loved there. She's just another number, another case. With me and Mrs. Eleanor, she's the center of our universe." It was then that Francesca asked the question Richard hadn't expected. "Are you willing to give up your company, your fortune, for this family?" Richard didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, in a heartbeat, even knowing it could cost you everything you've built in 40 years. "Francesca, I spent 40 years building an empty empire. In the last 2 months, I've built a family. I know which one is more important." The interview was ending when Francesca signaled to the crew. "Richard, we have a surprise for you, with special authorization from the hospital and Child Protective Services. Mrs. Eleanor and Isabella are here with us." The studio doors opened, and a wheelchair appeared, pushed by a nurse. Mrs. Eleanor was sitting in it, wearing a borrowed but clean outfit, her hair combed, and a radiant smile on her face. Beside her walked Isabella, wearing a simple but pretty dress, holding her grandmother's hand. Richard stood up so quickly he almost knocked over his chair. "You're here!" Isabella ran into his arms, and he scooped her up, twirling her in the air. "Uncle Richie, I saw you on TV. You said you love me." "And I do, little one, more than anything in the world." Mrs. Eleanor was brought over to them, and Richard knelt beside the wheelchair, holding her hand while still embracing Isabella. "Francesca," Mrs. Eleanor said, looking at the camera, "this man saved our lives, not just with money, but with love. He gave us back our dignity, our hope. Isabella isn't just my granddaughter, she's our granddaughter. And Richard isn't just a good man, he's the grandson of my heart. And I," Isabella said, turning to the camera with the natural confidence of children, "want to tell everyone that my Uncle Richie is the best dad in the world. He protects me, teaches me things, and always makes me smile. And anyone who doesn't understand what true love is." Francesca was visibly moved. "Isabella, do you have a message for the people watching?" "I do," Isabella perked up. "I want to say that family isn't just about who shares the same blood. Family is who takes care of you, who loves you, who stays by your side when everyone else leaves. And me, Grandma Eleanor, and Daddy Richie are a real family." Daddy Richie. She had said Daddy for the first time on national television in front of millions of people. Richard felt tears stream freely down his face, without any shame. "And now," Mrs. Eleanor said, taking something from a bag on her lap, "we want to show you something special." It was the original stick figure drawing, the one Isabella had sold to Richard on that cold morning that changed their lives. But now there was a fourth figure drawn beside the other three, added with a different colored pencil. "I drew you, Daddy," Isabella explained. "Now our family is complete in the drawing too." The studio was in absolute silence. Even the camera operators had stopped working to watch the scene. Francesca discreetly wiped her eyes before speaking. "I think we have proof here that true love doesn't need blood, doesn't need papers, doesn't need anything but hearts willing to love unconditionally." When the cameras turned off, Richard remained there, holding his 2 women, knowing that regardless of what happened in the courts, with Child Protective Services, or in public opinion, they had already won the most important battle, the battle to become a true family. The interview's impact was immediate and overwhelming. Even before the program ended, social media was flooded with messages of support. The hashtag Family from the Heart became the top trending topic in the country, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of unconventional families and true love. The next morning, Richard woke up to a call from Dr. Mendez, but this time with completely different news. "Richard, you won't believe this. Fred Castillo has dropped all charges." "What do you mean?" "Apparently he was pressured by his own investors. Public opinion has completely turned in your favor. Maintaining the accusations now would be commercial suicide for him." But the best news came 2 hours later when Dr. Carla Henderson, the psychologist from Child Protective Services, called personally. "Mr. Anderson, after evaluating the entire case, including yesterday's public testimony, we've decided to approve permanent custody of Isabella for you. The reports are unanimous. She is emotionally stable, developing appropriately, and has clearly established healthy emotional bonds with you and Mrs. Eleanor." Richard had to sit down. "Does that mean—" "It means Isabella can go home today, and the official adoption process can proceed without further obstacles." When Richard arrived at the hospital to pick up Mrs. Eleanor, who was finally being discharged, he found a crowd of journalists at the entrance. But these weren't the same aggressive reporters from previous days. Francesca Hayes was there, along with other reporters who wanted to cover the family's reunification. "Richard," Francesca called out when she saw him, "how does it feel knowing Isabella is officially in your custody?" "I feel complete," he replied, smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I feel like I finally understand the true meaning of wealth." Inside the hospital, Mrs. Eleanor was sitting on the bed, packing the few personal belongings she had brought. She was visibly stronger, and the sparkle had returned to her eyes. "My grandson," she said when she saw him enter. "I'm ready to go to our home." "Our home," Richard repeated, savoring the words. "Mrs. Eleanor, I want to propose something. How about we move out of Hope Creek? I found a beautiful house with a yard for Isabella to play in, a spacious kitchen for you, and comfortable rooms for all of us." Mrs. Eleanor looked at him carefully. "Son, as long as it's not out of pity or guilt from the past." "It's not pity nor guilt, it's love. It's family taking care of family." She smiled and nodded. "Then I accept. But on one condition. I want to continue cooking for your company. I like to feel useful." "Of course. In fact, your goodies have become so famous. I'm thinking of expanding the business. How about Grandma Eleanor's kitchen?" When they left the hospital, Isabella was waiting for them at the door, accompanied by the social worker who had become her ally. The girl ran to them, and the three embraced right there in front of the cameras and the crowd. "Daddy! Grandma!" "Let's go home," Isabella shouted, radiant with happiness. "Let's go home," Richard confirmed, picking her up. A week later, in the new house, a cozy home in a quiet neighborhood with a flower-filled yard and a tree perfect for a swing, Richard watched Isabella play in the yard while Mrs. Eleanor prepared lunch in the kitchen. Charles had become more than just a driver. He was almost an uncle to Isabella. His wife Marlene visited regularly, bringing their children to play. John visited on Sundays, always with stories to tell. The community that had formed around this unlikely family was proof that true love attracts more love. "Daddy," Isabella called from the yard, "come see what I planted." Richard approached and saw small sunflower seedlings she had planted with Mrs. Eleanor's help. "They're beautiful, little one." "Grandma said sunflowers always look towards the sun, just like our family. We always look on the bright side of things. Your grandma is very wise. And so are you, Daddy. You taught us that family is who we choose to love." That afternoon, as the three of them had dinner together at the kitchen table, Richard, Mrs. Eleanor, and Isabella, the stick figure, drawing hung on the main living room wall, lovingly framed. The four figures drawn by Isabella smiled, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Richard looked at his two women and realized he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a true family, built not by blood, but by the daily choice to love, protect, and care for one another. The man once known only for his business acumen now was a father, grandson, and son, all at the same time, and for the first time in his life, Richard Anderson was truly rich. 2 years had passed since that cold morning on Park Avenue that forever changed the lives of Richard, Isabella, and Mrs. Eleanor. The art gallery was elegantly decorated, with soft lights highlighting dozens of colorful paintings on the walls. It was the first solo exhibition for Isabella Santos Anderson, now officially an Anderson, after the adoption process was finalized. Richard adjusted his tie, as nervous as if he were the artist of the night. At 44, he had discovered that being a father was infinitely more challenging and rewarding than running a multinational corporation. Mrs. Eleanor, at 72, was radiant in her light blue dress, specially chosen for the occasion by Isabella. "Daddy, do you think people will like my drawings?" asked Isabella, now 10 years old, adjusting the red dress she had chosen for her big night. "Little one, your drawings tell stories of love, hope, and family. How could people not like them?" The gallery began to fill up. Richard's colleagues, neighbors, friends from Isabella's school, and many of the people who had supported the family during difficult times came. Charles and Marlene arrived with their children, now inseparable friends with Isabella. John showed up wearing his best suit, a proud smile on his face. Francesca Hayes, who had become a close family friend, circulated through the gallery, documenting the event for a year-end special on stories of resilience. "Richard," she said, approaching with her crew, "how does it feel seeing Isabella exhibiting her work?" "I feel like any proud father," he replied, watching Isabella excitedly explain her drawings to a group of visitors. "But there's something special about this. All these paintings tell the story of our family, of our journey." And it was true. The gallery walls displayed Isabella's artistic evolution, but also the emotional evolution of a family. There was the original stick figure drawing, now accompanied by an explanatory plaque telling its story. Beside it, more recent paintings showed the same family, now in a house with a yard, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and much love. One of the most touching paintings showed 3 people visiting a cemetery. Richard had taken Isabella to visit the graves of her biological parents, and she had drawn the moment they laid flowers and told their memories about the new family that had formed. "Grandma," Isabella called, approaching Mrs. Eleanor, "tell Aunt Francesca about your new project." Mrs. Eleanor smiled, still a little shy with the cameras. "Well, Grandma Eleanor's kitchen has grown so much that we now have a small factory. We employ 15 women from Hope Creek, all mothers who needed to work close to home." "And it doesn't stop there," Richard added. "We've just opened the second location. Mrs. Eleanor has become a successful businesswoman." "Oh, my grandson exaggerates," the old lady said, laughing. "I just do what I've always done. Cook with love. The difference is that now I can help other families too." The most emotional moment of the evening arrived when Isabella climbed onto a small, improvised stage to talk about her art. With the confidence of a loved and supported child, she held the microphone and looked at the audience. "Good evening, everyone. I want to thank everyone who came to see my drawings. Each painting here tells a little piece of my story, of our story." She pointed to Richard and Mrs. Eleanor. "When I was little and sold drawings on the street, I didn't know that one day I'd have a real family and an exhibition in an elegant gallery. The audience applauded, and Isabella continued. But the most important thing I learned is that family isn't just about who you're born with. Family is who chooses to stay together on happy days and sad days. It's who loves you, even when you make art with paint on the living room carpet. She looked mischievously at Richard, who laughed along with everyone present. I want to dedicate this exhibition to everyone who believes that love can transform lives, and especially to my daddy Richard and my grandma Eleanor, who taught me that when you draw with love, people can feel it. Tears streamed freely down Richard's eyes. He remembered that morning 2 years ago, when a small girl had touched his heart with a simple drawing and a story of need. Now, she stood there, a recognized artist, a beloved daughter, a confident and happy girl. After the event, when they returned home, the three of them sat in the living room for the nightly ritual they had developed, hot chocolate and conversation about the day. The original stick figure drawing was there on the wall, surrounded by happy family photos. "Daddy," Isabella said, snuggled between Richard and Mrs. Eleanor on the sofa. "Did you know that when I first saw you, I thought you looked sad?" "And you were right, little one. I was very sad. I just didn't know it." "And now?" Richard looked around the love-filled room, at the girl in his arms and the old woman who had become his second mother. "Now I know I've found everything I was always looking for without knowing it, a true family." "And I," Mrs. Eleanor said, kissing Isabella's forehead, "discovered that life can give us second chances at the most unexpected times." Isabella yawned, sleepy. "I'm going to draw that tomorrow. Second chances and true families." As Richard carried Isabella to her room, he paused before the stick figure drawing on the wall. There they were, 4 simple figures drawn by a child, representing the truest and most complete family he had ever known. From the orphaned boy who slept on the streets to the lonely millionaire, from the girl selling drawings for medicine to the recognized artist, from the unjustly treated and forgotten old woman to the respected businesswoman, they had all found in each other the redemption they hadn't even known they were seeking. And as the city slept outside, inside that house was a family that had chosen to love, care for, and protect each other, proving that the strongest bonds are not those of blood, but of the heart. The stick figure drawing would remain there, an eternal symbol that a simple act of kindness can transform destinies, and that true love always finds a way to flourish.